What if the biggest mystery in ancient Mesopotamia isn't what the Sumerians wrote down, but what they never dared to say? For almost 4,000 years, Sumerian scribes recorded everything. Kings being crowned and overthrown, floods rising and draining away, battles fought under a blood-red moon. Careful notes about the wandering path of Venus across the night sky. If something mattered in their world, they pressed it into clay. And yet, in the sacred ruins of Nippur, where Enlil's great courtyard once shook with hymns and the smoke of offerings curled into the sky, there is a strange silence. The mud brick remembers processions. The soil still holds the ash of sacrifices. The layout of the temple still hints at rituals lost to time. But in thousands of fragments of clay, in tablets scattered across museums from Baghdad to London, there is not a single clear line that says, "The Anunnaki have gone." They do not leave in triumph. They do not depart with a warning. They simply stop showing up. Their disappearance is not a recorded event in Sumerian history. It is a void, huge, deliberate, and still waiting to be understood. Before we sink deeper into that silence, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy wandering through forgotten temples, faded myths, and the edges of human memory. And if you're still here with me, I want you to do something simple. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I like to imagine those comments scattered across time zones, the way the names of the Anunnaki once echoed across ancient cities, different places, different hours, same question. Because this story does not begin with an ending, it begins with an absence. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists dug their way across southern Iraq, places like Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, and what they found, again and again, was not gold, not treasure, but something far stranger. Tablets, piles of tablets, shelves of tablets. They were stacked like fossilized thoughts, layer after layer of a civilization's memory baked into clay. They were written in cuneiform, the world's first true writing system. And here is the unsettling part. It does not look like a clumsy first attempt. There is no awkward pre-writing phase with random scratches and guessing. The very first cuneiform we can read is already sophisticated. The Sumerians went hard from day one. They documented their world with almost obsessive precision. King lists, city inventories, hymns for the gods, astronomical notes, legal codes, trade accounts, temple schedules, and woven through hundreds of these texts is a name that would haunt scholars for more than a century: the Anunnaki, the great gods, the council of heaven, the decreers of fate. So here is what should make you pause. If you walk through museum archives, scanning tablet after tablet under cold fluorescent light, you will find the Anunnaki everywhere in early Mesopotamian thought. They judge, they bless, they decide the destinies of kings and cities. And then, slowly, over the course of centuries, they thin out. Their names appear less in royal hymns. They fade from ritual texts. Temples, once dedicated to their presence, go quiet. But nowhere, not in a single Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, or Assyrian inscription, does any scribe write something like, "Today, the Anunnaki ascended back to the stars. Today, the Anunnaki left the earth behind." No final decree, no farewell ceremony, no cosmic goodbye, just silence. Scholars have wrestled with that silence for a long time, because history loves neat endings. If a group of divine beings dominate an entire civilization's view of the universe, we want a clear last chapter for them. The Anunnaki refuse to give us one. They do not vanish in a giant disaster. They do not climb into fiery chariots and blast into the night sky. They simply dissolve, like a name whispered too many times across too many generations until no one quite remembers why it mattered. And when there is a gap like that, the modern world rushes to fill it. You've seen it online. Videos claiming the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials who went back to a planet called Nibiru. Fringe theories suggesting they fled some coming catastrophe. Ancient astronaut. Stories imagining secret spaceports under ziggurats and launch pads hidden in temple courtyards. It sounds dramatic. It fits our science fiction imagination. But the clay tells a different story. Not a loud one, a quiet one, more subtle, more human, and honestly, much more unsettling. So let's slow down and do something simple. Imagine you are holding one of those tablets in your hand. It is smaller than you expect. It fits in your palm. The surface is covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks, each one pressed in by a reed stylus 4,000 years ago. You can still feel the shallow grooves where that reed bit into wet clay. This is not a mystical prophecy preserved for the future. Most of the time, it is bureaucracy, ration lists, ritual timetables, genealogies of the gods. One text, Enki and the World Order, lists the Anunnaki as a council, each one given specific roles in maintaining the cosmic system. Another, Inanna's Descent to the Underworld, places 7 Anunnaki as judges in the land of the dead. Early Sumerian hymns call them the 50 great gods, children of An, the Sky Father, a divine assembly that shapes destinies and holds the universe together. Notice what they are not called. They are not described as travelers from beyond the stars. They are not shown in metal suits. They are not flying in machines. They are not aliens. They are rank. They are authority. They are sacred law. If you lived in a Sumerian city, you lived under the gaze of the Anunnaki. Every ziggurat, those giant stepped temples, was a meeting place between their realm and ours. Every king ruled by their decree. Every offering burned on a temple altar was understood as food for their presence. And then, over many centuries, something started to shift. Not a single dramatic event, not an explosion in the sky, not a global flood, but a slow, steady change that took nearly 2,000 years. When Sargon of Akkad rose to power around 2300 BC, he did something no Sumerian king had managed. He unified the independent Sumerian city-states into something like the world's first true empire. His scribes still carved cuneiform into clay. They still used Sumerian myths and Sumerian gods. But Sargon and his successors spoke Akkadian, not Sumerian, and as they borrowed the old religion, they also reshaped it. An, the sky god, became Anu. Inanna became Ishtar. Enki became Ea. The Anunnaki were still there, still powerful, still respected, but within this new Akkadian religious system, they were no longer at the very top. By the time Babylon rose and the god Marduk took center stage in the famous Enuma Elish creation story, the Anunnaki had become his council, still divine, still great, but now they were supporting characters, not the Supreme Court, more like the cabinet. Fast forward again to the Neo-Assyrian period. The word Anunnaki barely shows up in royal inscriptions anymore. Later, in Babylon's final centuries, the old names mostly survive only in scholarly lists and priestly traditions, not in everyday worship. The temples that once rang with hymns to the Anunnaki, empty. The rituals that once kept their presence alive, discontinued. And as new religions rose over the ancient Near East, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, the old gods were gradually reframed, downgraded, or flat out condemned. The Anunnaki were not killed. They were not overthrown in a single battle. They were forgotten into irrelevance. So, how does a god disappear? Not by flying away, but by running out of people who still need that god. not by abandoning the world, but by the world abandoning the structures that made that God real in human consciousness. Some researchers point to shifts in political theology. Others emphasize the rise of monotheism and its tendency to flatten divine hierarchies. A few trace faint echoes of old worship lingering far into the medieval period. But at some point, the last priest left the last functioning temple, and no one wrote down the moment that happened. No one said, "Today, the Anunnaki are gone." They just stopped being present, stopped being spoken, stopped being needed. And that, more than any spaceship or lost planet, is the real mystery. So if the tablets never say the Anunnaki left, then what do they actually tell us? To answer that, we have to do something the internet rarely does. We have to start where the ancient scribes started, not with wild theories, not with spaceships and secret planets, but with the world that created the Anunnaki in the first place. Picture yourself in a scribe's room in ancient Nippur around 2400 BC. The room is small and cool, its walls made of clay, narrow windows let in slanted afternoon light, dust hangs in the air. Outside, you might hear the sounds of animals, merchants calling out in the streets, the distant echo of temple music. In front of you is a low table. On it, fresh tablets, still damp. Beside them, a reed stylus, trimmed to a sharp wedge. Along one wall, stacked in clay jars, are older records that you're supposed to copy and preserve. God lists, temple accounts, offering schedules, hymns to be sung at specific festivals. This is not magical work, it's administration. You are not channeling messages from the stars. You are doing what every responsible bureaucracy does, keeping things organized. The gods must be named in the right order. Their portions of sacrificed sheep must be calculated precisely. Their genealogies have to be kept straight, so priests know which deity to approach for which problem. You reach for one of the older tablets. The clay has been hard for decades, maybe longer. Your fingertips trace the worn wedge marks, reading them out loud in your mind. And there it is, pressed into the clay with the same calm precision as a tax record. Anunnaki, the great gods, 50 in number, children of An, the Sky Father. Not visitors, not travelers from another planet, not engineers from elsewhere. They are simply part of the way the universe is structured. In the Sumerian worldview, the Anunnaki are native to the cosmos, as natural to them as the mountains, as the Tigris and Euphrates, as the turning of the seasons. They belong to the divine order that existed before human memory. This is where modern confusion starts, and where ancient clarity is still waiting to be heard. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are never described as beings who arrived from somewhere else. You don't get a story about them landing or appearing suddenly. They just are. The way daylight is, the way gravity is for us, an assumed part of reality. Some of the oldest surviving compositions mention them almost casually. The debate between winter and summer, one of the earliest literary pieces we have, casts the Anunnaki as witnesses and judges in a cosmic argument between the seasons. The instructions of Shurupak, which many scholars see as one of the oldest wisdom texts in human history, refers to the Anunnaki as the authorities who hold the fates of cities. They show up in the background of everything involving power, justice, and sacred order. If you lived in that world, you didn't need anyone to explain them to you. They were built into the mental operating system. But in one myth in particular, Enki and the world order, their role becomes crystal clear. In this story, the god Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water, travels through the world assigning duties to other deities. One god gets control over irrigation and canals. Another gets charge of wild animals. Another governs writing and scribal arts. another oversees grain. And behind all these assignments is the Anunnaki. They are the grand council that must approve the arrangement. They are not builders. They are not manual workers. They are legislators. Think of them less like astronauts and more like a supreme court, a senate of heaven, a divine high council whose decisions ripple down into every level of reality. When Enki declares that a certain goddess will rule over fish and birds, that decision is valid because the Anunnaki stand behind it. They are the assembly that makes divine decrees legally binding in the cosmic system. Their authority comes from their ancestry. They are the offspring of An, the distant sky god whose very name means heaven. In Sumerian cosmology, and lives in the highest realm of the universe, far above Earth. Below him are the major gods, like Enlil, lord of wind and earth, Enki, lord of wisdom and water, Inanna, goddess of love, war, and the morning star. Around and beneath these great gods is the broader council of the Anunnaki. They are the high-ranking deities who, in assembly, decree what will be. Early hymns don't hide this structure. They brag about it. One praise song to Nippur says the Anunnaki gather there to determine destinies. Another hymn calls them the great princes who stand by the divine plans and guard the decrees of heaven and earth. They are not alien visitors in strange gear. They are not secretly mining resources. They are the sacred, legal system of the universe, the civilization's own gods, the ones who make kings legitimate, who sanctify temples, who keep wheat growing, rivers flooding, and society running. Here's what you don't see in the texts. You don't see them wearing unfamiliar technology. You don't see them described as metal-clad, machine-using beings. You don't see them piloting vehicles. When Sumerian texts talk about gods appearing on Earth, they use a different kind of language. Visions, statues coming alive during ritual, divine presence descending onto the tops of ziggurats. Their heaven is not outer space. It is a higher, hidden layer of reality that runs parallel to the visible world. If you walked up to a Sumerian priest and said, "So, when they descended from heaven, you mean they came from another planet, right?" They would not know what you were talking about. To them, the sky is not a physical vacuum filled with stars and planets like we imagine. It is layered. First, the visible sky where birds fly and storms form. Above that, higher heavens where the great gods dwell. Beyond that, the most distant divine realm of An. So, to say the Anunnaki are of heaven means they belong to that sacred order. They are part of the unchanging structure that keeps the universe from falling apart. They are the architecture of order itself. Now, let's zoom in on how they connect to everyday life. Each Sumerian city-state had its own patron god. Nippur had Enlil, Uruk had Inanna, Eridu had Enki, Ur had Nanna, the moon god. But behind and above these city gods stood the wider council of the Anunnaki. They were invoked when kings took the throne. They were invoked before major decisions. They were honored in big festivals that marked planting, harvest, and the flooding of the rivers. At the center of each city was a ziggurat, a huge, layered tower of mud brick. The Sumerians called it an eker, or mountain house, an artificial sacred mountain where heaven and earth touched. On its summit was a small shrine, the point of contact. Imagine standing at the base of one of these ziggurats. The structure rises in huge steps, 3 or more massive platforms stacked upward. People are climbing the long staircase. Some carry baskets of bread, others carry jars of beer. Others hold small animals for sacrifice. The air smells like dust, sweat, incense, and roasted meat. At the top, priests perform a daily routine. They feed the god's statue, setting food and drink in front of it. They change its garments. They burn fragrant woods. They recite hymns written generations earlier. To us, this might look like superstition. To them, this was technology, not mechanical technology. Ritual technology, the technology of presence. The idea was simple but powerful. As long as the correct rituals are performed, the gods remain actively present in the world. As long as offerings are made, hymns are sung, and temple duties are fulfilled, the link between heaven and earth stays open. If rituals stop, if no one makes offerings, if the temple is neglected, the god's presence fades from that place. In this system, the Anunnaki are foundational, but they are usually invisible. They are not your favorite deity you pray to for a good barley harvest or protection in battle. They are the cosmic framework that allows those prayers to mean anything in the first place. They stand behind the scenes as the assembly that backs the patron gods, the witnesses when a king claims authority, the highest court when oaths are sworn or laws declared. In legal terms, they are the ultimate appellate court. There is no appeal beyond them. But if you read these early Sumerian texts closely, something interesting happens. The Anunnaki are everywhere and nowhere, always invoked as a group, almost never described as individuals. We know the personalities of gods like Enlil, Enki, Inanna. We have entire stories about their quarrels, victories, loves, and failures. But the Anunnaki, they stay strangely collective, a council, an assembly, a plural force acting as one. It's as if they weren't meant to be characters at all. They represent something more abstract, not a god with a face, but the very principle of divine order. And that abstraction, that facelessness, would matter later, because when politics changed, when empires rose and kings wanted to centralize power, it became much easier to quietly reorganize a faceless council than to try to erase beloved, well-known gods with specific temples, festivals, and priesthoods. Named gods with rich stories can fight back, at least culturally. People protest when their favorite deity is insulted or sidelined. But a council, a vague group, an abstract authority, that can be rearranged quietly, demoted, absorbed, which leads us to the next big question. If the Anunnaki started out as the supreme council of heaven, unchanging guardians of cosmic law, where do we first see them shifting away from that role? And what pressures, on earth, not in the sky, were strong enough to push even the decreers of fate into a different position in the divine order? While scribes in Nippur were still carefully pressing the names of the Anunnaki into wet clay, something was changing in the world outside their temple walls. At first, it had nothing to do with religion. It started with marching feet and moving armies. Around 2334 BC, a war leader from the north named Sargon began pushing his way through southern Mesopotamia. He did not speak Sumerian. His language was Akkadian, a Semitic tongue with different sounds and different grammar. He came from a city called Akkad, somewhere in northern Mesopotamia. The exact location is still unknown, lost under layers of later ruins. What is not lost is what he did. In a very short time, Sargon did what no Sumerian king had managed. He broke the independence of the city-states and created something new. Instead of a patchwork of rival cities with their own kings, their own gods, and their own temple systems, he built a unified empire. New political structure meant new questions about the gods. Sargon did not throw away Sumerian culture. He adopted it. His scribes used the same cuneiform system the Sumerians had invented. They kept the same basic legal traditions. They copied Sumerian hymns and myths, but they did not simply inherit them. They translated them. They adapted them. they reshaped them to fit a new imperial identity. The old sky god An became Anu in Akkadian. The fierce goddess Inanna became Ishtar. The clever water god Enki became Ea. The old names shifted. The accents changed. The prayers were spoken in a different language. And slowly, the relationships between the gods started to move as well. The Anunnaki were still there. They were still called great gods. Kings still invoked them in inscriptions. But now they were part of a broader, more flexible divine order. The sharp structure of an assembly of 50 supreme gods that once matched a world of many independent city-states began to soften under the pressure of a single empire. The pattern is easy to miss because it does not happen overnight. It shows up in little details. An Akkadian king dedicates a victory to Ishtar and all the great gods, and the Anunnaki are included in that phrase instead of standing alone as the highest council. A hymn lists Marduk, Ishtar, Shamash, and others by name, then adds a brief mention of the Anunnaki as a group in the background instead of focusing on them as the main authority. They are still important, still feared, still honored, but they are no longer the fixed center of the system. They are becoming part of a category, not the category itself. What happens in the sky is now tracking what happened on the ground. When political power consolidates, divine power consolidates along with it. Heaven begins to look more like an empire and less like a council. The Akkadian Empire did not last forever. After less than 2 centuries, it cracked under invasions, rebellions, and climate stress. The Sumerian cities pushed back and entered what historians call the Third Dynasty of Ur. For a time, it looked like the old order had returned. Temples were rebuilt. Sumerian hymns flourished again. The language of the tablets swung back to Sumerian as the main sacred language. In that period, texts speak once more of the Anunnaki in their older role. They are witnesses at coronations. They are the ones who decree kingship. They are described as judges of cosmic law. Nippur is again praised as the place where their assembly meets. But the world was no longer the same. The idea of empire had entered the region and would not leave. The memory of what Sargon accomplished lingered in stories and political imagination. Someone had shown that many cities could be ruled from one center. Once that idea exists, it is very hard to stuff it back into the box. The next big step came a few centuries later with a city that would become a legend, Babylon. Around 1792 BC, a king named Hammurabi took the throne of Babylon. At first, Babylon was not special. It was one competitor among many, surrounded by rival cities and rival kings. Through military campaigns, smart diplomacy, and relentless ambition, Hammurabi changed that balance. Over 4 decades of rule, he turned Babylon into the dominant power in southern Mesopotamia. With that rise came a new problem. If Babylon was now at the center of the map, what did that mean for the map of the gods? Babylon did have a patron deity. His name was Marduk. Before Hammurabi, Marduk was respectable but not supreme. He was the son of Ea, connected to fresh water, vegetation, and justice. Important, yes, but not the highest power in the cosmos. An and Enlil still outranked him in older traditions. The Anunnaki still formed the Great Council. That hierarchy did not match the new reality on the ground. If Babylon was now the capital of the human world, its god needed to be at the top of the divine world as well. It was not enough to conquer cities. The structure of heaven had to be rewritten. This was not done with a legal code alone. It was done with a story. The story is known today as the Enuma Elish, often called the Babylonian creation epic. On the surface, it tells how the world came into being. Underneath, it is a carefully crafted political argument in mythic form. In this story, everything begins as water. The older gods, born from this primeval ocean, are disturbed by the noise and activity of the younger gods. Conflict breaks out. The ancient sea goddess Tiamat creates terrifying monsters to crush the rebellious younger generation. The divine council is afraid. None of the familiar high gods want to face her. Then Marduk steps forward. He is young, brilliant, equipped with powerful weapons. He offers to fight Tiamat on one clear condition. If he wins, he becomes the supreme ruler, not just of the younger gods, but of all gods. The assembly agrees. Marduk defeats Tiamat, splits her body in two, and uses her remains to build heaven and earth. He sets the stars in place, organizes the calendar, and assigns roles to other gods. Babylon is declared the center of the universe, and Marduk's temple becomes the axis of creation. Then comes the crucial twist, the Anunnaki bow. The story has them prostrate themselves before Marduk. They proclaim him king. They hand over their own authority. An, the old sky father, transfers his command to the younger god. The 50 great gods who once formed the supreme council are now given new tasks. They will build Marduk's temple. They will serve in his court. They will carry out his commands. On paper, they are still honored. Their names are still recited. Their status is still high. Yet their role is different. They used to be the council that decreed fate. Now they are the staff that implements the decisions of a single divine monarch. The constitution of heaven has been rewritten. The old model was a council of powers that balanced each other. The new model is a single throne surrounded by advisors. The logic is transparent when you compare it to Hammurabi's world. Many independent city-states now answer to a single capital. Many local rulers answer to one king. In the same way, many gods now answer to one supreme deity. The Anunnaki have not been erased. They have been reorganized. You can see this in how later texts talk about them. Prayers and hymns from after Hammurabi's time use phrases like, Marduk assembled the Anunnaki. Marduk commanded the Anunnaki to attend him. They are still called great gods, but the grammar has changed. They are no longer the subject. They are the object. They are not the ones doing the commanding. They are the ones being summoned. The comparison that fits is a supreme court that still exists in name, but no longer has the power to issue independent rulings. It can only approve decisions already made by a higher authority. The institution survives, in theory. Its essence has been hollowed out in practice. That pattern continues when Assyria rises to power in the north. The Assyrians elevate their own patron god, Ashur, to the highest rank and apply the same logic. Ashur absorbs many of Marduk's features. The Anunnaki shift court again and appear as part of Ashur's divine retinue. Later, when Babylon briefly regains control, the script flips back and Marduk regains the top position. Once again, the Anunnaki are part of his court. By this point, they have become a floating category. They still represent status and prestige. They still sound impressive in ritual language. Yet the structure of the system no longer depends on them. In the Neo-Assyrian period, around the 8th century BC, the word Anunnaki shows up less often in royal inscriptions. Kings now prefer broader phrases like all the great gods or the gods of heaven and earth. The Council of 50 is fading into a general crowd. What is happening is not persecution. No one is burning tablets that mention the Anunnaki. No one is staging holy wars against their name. The process is quieter. The system they once embodied is becoming unnecessary. A council model is less useful in a world that thinks in terms of single rulers. The heavens are being simplified. They are being streamlined to fit the political imagination of empires. The Anunnaki are still there, but their job description has changed. They are no longer the backbone of cosmic government. They are reliable high officials in a structure that no longer really needs them. The question then becomes sharper. Once their role in the highest level of heaven is weakened, where do they go next in the religious imagination? If they are no longer the supreme council above, do they drift upward into abstraction or downward into some other realm entirely? When a group of gods gets pushed out of the top tier of heaven, there are only so many places left for them to go in the ancient imagination. They can rise into a more distant, abstract realm where they are hardly ever mentioned, or they can sink. In Mesopotamian religion, sinking does not mean falling into a fiery hell. It means moving into the deep places beneath the earth. The dark region the Sumerians called Kur, the land of no return. That is where the Anunnaki start showing up, not in the big sky council over kings and cities, not as the group that decides who will rule where. Instead, they appear in the shadows, in the realm of the dead, not as visitors either, as permanent residents. The most vivid portrait of this shift comes from one of the oldest and most haunting myths from the region, the story of Inanna's descent. Imagine the narrative as a slowly unfolding dream. Inanna is the goddess of love and war. She is queen of heaven. She is fierce, ambitious, radiant. One day she decides to go down into the underworld. The text gives different hints about why. Maybe she is going to attend a funeral. Maybe she wants to extend her rule. Maybe she just wants to visit her sister Ereshkigal, who reigns below. The story does not give a simple motive. That lack of clarity makes the whole journey feel dangerous. Before she leaves, she adorns herself with all the symbols of power: a crown, earrings, necklace, breastplate, 2 divine items that symbolize measurement and authority, rings and garments, 7 layers in total. Each piece represents a part of her status. The underworld has 7 gates. At the first gate, the guard stops her and demands one of those items. She protests, but the rules are firm. She gives up the crown. At the second gate, another item. At the third, another. By the time she reaches the last gate, everything that marked her as Queen of Heaven is gone. She enters the throne room of the underworld naked, stripped of rank. Waiting inside is not only Ereshkigal, there is also a group of judges. The text names them, the 7 Anunnaki of the underworld. These are not kindly figures. Their eyes are described as eyes of death. They look at Inanna. They speak a judgment. Their decision is final. She is struck down. Her body is hung on a hook like a piece of meat and left that way for 3 days. This image is brutal and strangely cold. These Anunnaki are not the distant legislative council watching over cosmic order in some bright heavenly chamber. They are judges of the dead. They are linked directly to punishment and confinement. They are authorities of the lowest realm. That location changes everything. Older hymns sometimes connect the Anunnaki to the underworld in passing. Maybe some of them handle judgment for the dead. Maybe they keep the cosmic structure stable down below the earth. In those references, the underworld is one of the places where they work, not their primary home. Over time, that balance flips. Texts from the 2nd millennium BC and later start to speak more directly about the Anunnaki as underworld powers. Akkadian prayers mention the Anunnaki of the underworld. They are described as dwelling in darkness. In some ritual texts, when scribes list judges of the dead, the Anunnaki are placed firmly in the realm beneath. Later, lists of deities speak of the Anunnaki who rule in the land of no return. They oversee the fates of the dead. They stand at the entrance halls. They record or confirm what happens to souls once they cross the threshold. In other words, the divine council that once stood at the top of the cosmic ladder now appears near the bottom. This is not unique to Mesopotamia. The pattern shows up again and again across different cultures. When a younger generation of gods rises, the old ones are rarely just deleted. That would be too abrupt for people who grew up with those names. Instead, the older gods are pushed down into deeper layers of reality. In Greek myth, the older generation is the Titans. When Zeus and the Olympians overthrew them, they did not erase them. They locked them in Tartarus, far below the world. The Titans became part of the structure of the deep. In Irish tradition, the Tuatha De Danann once ruled as shining gods. Later stories move them into the hollow hills. They become beings of the other world, tied to the dead and to hidden places. When Christianity moved through Europe, many of the old gods were recast as demons. The names survived, the roles shifted. Powers that once ruled the weather, the harvest, or the sea were now said to lurk below as dark forces. In Mesopotamia, something similar happens, but more subtly. As gods like Marduk and Ashur rise to the top, someone still has to govern the neglected regions, the dark places, the spaces that the main gods do not wish to personally oversee. The underworld is one of those places. The Anunnaki are too important to just vanish. They are too deeply embedded in sacred tradition to be openly insulted, so they are moved. They are given a new domain, one that sounds like an honor. You can imagine a priest explaining it neatly. The Great Council now presides over the land where all mortals go. The Anunnaki judge the dead. They maintain order among countless ancestors. They guard the final boundary. This sounds noble on the surface. In practical terms, it removes them from active involvement in the everyday world. They no longer assign roles to living gods. They no longer shape the destinies of cities and kings in the same way. Their power becomes reactive. They respond to what happens instead of directing it. That shift is easy to hide in ritual language. The texts never openly say that the Anunnaki have been demoted. They simply describe their new duties. Whether those duties are promotion or exile depends on who is reading. The underworld in Mesopotamian thought is not a place of fire. It is dusty and dim. The dead live there in a weakened state. They eat dust. They drink muddy water. They exist, but with less color and force than in life. It is not a prison for the wicked alone. It is a universal endpoint. Someone has to organize that endless crowd. Someone has to keep records and enforce whatever rules apply. Assigning this job to the Anunnaki can be read in two opposite ways. On one side, it could be a high-trust assignment. The oldest council is given the most serious responsibility. They guard the final stage of every life. They make sure that even in darkness, order remains. On the other side, it can be read as a quiet sidelining. Let the new throne gods manage history, war, kingship, and empire. Give the old council a realm that is sealed off from the living. Let them govern what no longer changes. Either way, the symbolic weight is clear. The Anunnaki are now tied to endings rather than beginnings. They are associated with the place all rulers eventually reach when crowns and titles no longer matter. In the story of Inanna, there is a line where her death begins to affect the world above. Plants stop growing, animals stop mating, life itself slows. The underworld must eventually release her, or everything collapses. In that sense, the underworld is not separate from life. It feeds back into it. The Anunnaki who judge the dead are still part of cosmic balance. They have not been emptied of power. Their power has shifted to a different phase of the cycle. Yet they do not leave that role again. No myth shows them being rescued and returned to their old position as cosmic legislators. They remain in the lower realm. This movement of the Anunnaki from sky to depth sets the stage for what happens next in the story of religion across the region. New belief systems will not just move them downward, they will start questioning whether they belong anywhere at all. Once the Anunnaki were anchored more firmly in the underworld, their story could have ended quietly. They could have remained as the old judges of the dead, mentioned here and there, respected but distant. Instead, something more radical arrived from outside Mesopotamia. It did not begin with soldiers or kings. It began with a voice. Somewhere in the Iranian highlands, around the middle of the first millennium BC, a religious teacher started preaching a new vision of reality. His name was Zarathustra, known later in Greek as Zoroaster. According to this vision, the universe was not governed by a council of many gods. It was shaped by a struggle between two fundamental forces. On one side stood Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, god of truth, light, and order. On the other side stood Angra Mainyu, a destructive spirit, source of lies and chaos. Everything else, all other spiritual beings, ideas, and entities, needed to be understood in relation to that clash. There was no comfortable middle ground. This was not just another divine hierarchy, it was a different logic entirely. A clean split between the side of truth and the side of deception. For old regional gods, that created a problem. In earlier systems, there was room for many divine figures. Some were more powerful, some less. Some were widely worshipped. Others were local. They could compete and cooperate, form alliances, and shift status. In the worldview that grew out of Zarathustra's teaching, many of those older figures were relabeled. The word used for false gods, hostile powers, was a term that would later echo in other traditions, devas. Beings that were once gods of place or tribe were reimagined as deceptive spirits, tricking humans into misplaced worship. Instead of rival deities, they became something like agents of the wrong side. This shift did not stay confined to a few sermons in the hills. When the Persian Empire rose under Cyrus the Great and expanded across a wide sweep of territory, including Mesopotamia, this new way of thinking about divinity began to spread with it. The issue for older gods, like the Anunnaki, was not just that they were pushed into the underworld, it was that the entire category they belonged to was under review. A world full of many gods, each with specific temples and rituals, no longer looked like a reasonable description of reality to people influenced by this new perspective. It looked like a mistake, a long-term error in spiritual perception. In that kind of framework, the Anunnaki were not dangerous rivals. They were outdated labels. They represented an older system that did not fit the new map. While this was happening from the east, a different kind of pressure was building from the west, from a small kingdom that did not look like much on a map, the kingdom of Judah. In 586 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II captured Jerusalem. The city was sacked, its temple was destroyed. Many members of the elite, including priests and scribes, were taken into exile in Babylon. For the people of Judah, this was a disaster. For the history of religion, it was a turning point. Imagine being one of those exiles. You grew up hearing that your God, Yahweh, had chosen your people, your city, your temple. Now you are living in the capital of the empire that crushed you. Every day you can see the ziggurats and temples of Babylon towering above the streets. You walk past processions dedicated to Marduk, to Ishtar, to Shamash. You visit marketplaces where people casually mention other gods as if they are simply part of life. The ruins of your own temple live in your mind, while the temples of your conquerors stand tall around you. That is the environment in which large parts of the Hebrew scriptures were edited, shaped, and composed. The opening lines of Genesis, describing a single God bringing order to chaotic waters through speech, would have sounded familiar in some ways to anyone who knew Mesopotamian myths. The frame is similar, but the cast is almost empty. No divine council debates whether creation should happen. No older gods are slain to make the sky and earth. There is one speaker, one will, one authority. Other passages in Hebrew writings still preserve traces of an older structure. In the book of Job, the scene opens with a heavenly gathering where the sons of God present themselves before Yahweh. In certain psalms, there are hints of a divine assembly where the God of Israel stands among other spiritual beings. The shape feels familiar. It looks a little like the ancient idea of a council. The difference is not in the outline. It is in the balance of power. The older members of the council are no longer independent authorities. They are not equals. They are messengers, servants, or minor figures whose significance depends entirely on the one God at the center. The structure of the divine council has been stripped down and repurposed. What used to be a balanced gathering of great gods becomes a kind of staff meeting where only one voice truly matters. Foreign gods are not treated as peers in this system. They are not rival members of a cosmic senate. They are barely granted existence. Hebrew texts refer to them as the gods of the nations, as idols, as nothing. They are mocked as objects made of wood and stone for people who cannot tell the difference between a carved image and the God who made the world. In this light, there is no need to name the Anunnaki directly. They fall under the general category that is being rejected. Gods who require temples and food offerings are seen as products of human hands rather than true sources of being. To a priest standing in a rebuilt Jerusalem centuries later, the religious world of ancient Nippur would not look like a different version of the same truth. It would look like a long chain of misunderstandings. Divine councils do not vanish in this new thinking. They are recast as scenes where one God consults lesser beings. Angels and other figures appear, but they do not legislate. They do not form a group that can overrule the central will. This is a quiet but devastating move for older gods. They are not defeated in a dramatic cosmic war. They are treated as unnecessary. Their worship is not described as one option among many. It is framed as a basic category error. People mistook created things for the Creator. In that logic, asking what happened to the Anunnaki is roughly like asking where all the older constellations of misunderstanding went. From that point of view, they were never what people thought they were in the first place. Then another development adds still more pressure. A new movement grows out of Judaism itself, focused on the figure of Jesus and spreading first through Jewish communities, then to non-Jewish populations around the Roman Empire. Christian preachers and writers take over the monotheistic framework and add a strong missionary impulse. They are not content to guard their own religious boundaries. They want to transform the entire religious map. In their writings, Babylon becomes a symbol, not just a city from the past. It stands for spiritual corruption, arrogance, and opposition to the true God. The gods once worshipped in those temples are not just wrong, they are associated with dark forces. Paul writes that the gods of the nations are in reality demons. The book of Revelation describes a final collapse of a symbolic Babylon, a fall that is as much religious as political. By this point, there is almost no space left for a figure like the Anunnaki to exist as a neutral character. If they are remembered at all, they belong on the side that must be rejected. Later, as Christianity moves into positions of power under Roman emperors, this theology gains teeth. Old temples are closed by law, sacrifices are banned, sacred images are smashed or reinterpreted. Sites once dedicated to many gods are converted into churches. The old divine systems are not just ignored, they are systematically dismantled. For gods like the Anunnaki, this final layer of change is not a single event. It is more like a long weather pattern eroding what remains of a shoreline. By the time Islam rises in the 7th century and spreads through former Mesopotamian lands, the process is largely complete. Islamic teaching reinforces the idea that associating any partners with the one God is a serious error. All older gods are treated as false. Their worship is described as a mistake that must be corrected. At that stage, the Anunnaki are not just low-ranking. They are not simply forgotten judges of the dead. They represent a type of belief that has been spiritually disqualified. They no longer have a niche in the religious imagination. The model of many regional gods, organized in councils, has been replaced by a model built around a single universal deity and a supporting caste that is far more limited in function. Yet even then, religious memory is not completely clean. Some of the old patterns refuse to disappear. They survive in quiet corners, in local rituals, in seasonal customs, and in communities that manage to hold on to fragments of older practices within a new religious landscape. If you follow the big, official stories of religion, it can sound like the old gods vanished cleanly. One age ends, another begins. A new faith arrives with a new scripture, and suddenly everyone is praying in a different direction. Reality is never that tidy. Even as kings issued decrees and priests wrote new theologies, certain places and communities held on to older patterns much longer than the big narratives admit. One of those places sat far to the north of Babylon, where the Euphrates winds its way toward what is now southeastern Turkey. The city was called Haran. You might recognize the name from the Hebrew Bible as the place where Abraham's family stayed for a time. In that story, it is a stopover. In the longer arc of Mesopotamian religion, it was something much more. Haran was one of the main centers of worship for the moon god. The Sumerians called him Nana. Later cultures knew him as Sin. His lineage went back to the earliest layers of the Mesopotamian pantheon. He was the son of Enlil and the father of important gods like Shamash and Ishtar. In the classical period and into late antiquity, Haran kept that older tradition alive. Centuries after Babylon's political power had peaked, religious life in Haran still revolved around the phases of the moon and the movements of the planets. The city became famous for its star watchers, temple rituals, and learned priests. When early Islamic scholars and travelers wrote about Haran in the 8th and 9th centuries, they found something surprising. There was a group of people there who still maintained temples. They followed an elaborate calendar of rituals tied to the planets and stars. They dressed in distinctive robes. They guarded sacred books, written in an older language related to Aramaic and Syriac. Their practices looked like a living fossil of ancient Mesopotamian astral religion. These people called themselves Sabians. The term shows up briefly in the Quran as one of the communities recognized alongside Jews and Christians as having some kind of legitimate scripture. The exact identity of the original Sabians mentioned in the Quran is debated, but the people of Haran saw an opportunity. By identifying themselves with that name, they claimed protected status under Islamic rule. That move allowed them to keep practicing a form of star-focused worship inside a world that had largely turned toward one god. Their rituals honored the 7 classical planets. Their temple imagery still carried symbols that would have been familiar to priests from much older civilizations. They were not Sumerians, and they may not have remembered the term Anunnaki. Yet their religious structure rested on many of the same assumptions. The idea that divine forces express themselves through celestial bodies, the idea that proper rituals maintain harmony between the heavens and the earth, the idea that cosmic order is something humans must cooperate with through ceremony. In a way, they were preserving the skeleton of the old Mesopotamian sacred system long after its original names had faded. Haran was not the only place where echoes of the older gods survived. Scattered across villages in Syria, Iraq, and surrounding regions, ordinary people kept up customs that had outlived the official temples where those customs began. One of the most persistent patterns centered on a figure named Dumuzi in Sumerian and Tammuz in later languages. He was a shepherd king and a lover of Inanna. His myth told of death and descent to the underworld. His yearly suffering and partial return were tied to the agricultural cycle. When the summer heat burned the fields, people saw his death. When green shoots returned, they saw his revival. This pattern of mourning and renewal was ancient even by Babylonian standards. The Hebrew prophet Ezekiel, writing in the 6th century BC, mentions being shown women at the gate of the Jerusalem temple who were weeping for Tammuz. For him, that was a sign of corruption, an intrusion of foreign ritual into the worship of Yahweh. From another angle, it is evidence of how deeply embedded these older rites were in the emotional rhythm of the region. Women were grieving a dying god at the height of summer because that grief matched what their fields and bodies were experiencing. The land felt scorched and exhausted. Loss needed an image. Centuries later, Christian writers complained about similar practices. People in the Eastern Mediterranean were still gathering during the hot month of July, which in some local calendars was literally called Tammuz, to sing laments and perform mourning rituals. The words might have shifted on the surface, redirected toward different figures to avoid trouble with church authorities, but the structure was the same, a period of ritualized sorrow for a power tied to fertility and growth. Medieval Islamic sources also mention local customs in which women gather, tear at their hair, cry aloud, and chant in the burning month. The explanations attached to these acts had changed. The emotional pattern had not. No priest in those later centuries needed to mention the Anunnaki for their influence to linger. A ritual that once might have unfolded in front of a statue in a temple courtyard could now take place in a village lane, framed as a family tradition. The original theology was gone for most participants. The actions remained. You can picture how that passes through time. A grandmother shows her granddaughter how to sing a certain melody at a certain time of year. She explains it as something their people have always done. The names of the gods connected to it in deep antiquity are no longer on her tongue. The feeling is, even as official theology changes, those small acts keep a thin thread of continuity alive, yet threads can break. The Sabians of Haran did not stay protected forever. When political climates shifted and religious tolerance tightened, they came under pressure from both religious and state authorities. Their temples were torn down, then rebuilt, then torn down again. Over the course of a few centuries, their numbers shrank. Eventually, the last clear references to their astral rituals disappear from written records. At some point, without any grand announcement, their line of practice ended. No one wrote, "Today the last star ritual of Haran was performed. It would have looked like any other day." A priest, perhaps already old, carried out a ceremony as he always had. He read chants from a weathered text. He lit a flame. He watched the sky and made offerings. He did not know that no one after him would repeat the full ritual. Elsewhere, maybe in a village far from any city, an elderly woman led a lament in the month of Tammuz for the last time. Her daughters or granddaughters had already been pulled into stricter interpretations of their faith. They might have joined out of respect, or watched quietly, or refused to participate. When that woman died, the song went with her. No stranger wrote down the melody. No stone marked that loss. The custom was absorbed into silence. This is what the end of a god looks like on the ground. Not a thunderclap, not a clear-cut date in a history book, not a final conflict that everyone remembers. It looks like a series of tiny breaks in memory. One generation stops visiting a certain shrine. One family stops passing down certain prayers. One village stops making offerings at a particular hill. Over time, the spaces once filled with ritual become ordinary. The ziggurat of the moon god in Ur was left behind as the river changed course and the city declined. The great temple of Enlil in Nippur, once the beating heart of the Anunnaki's authority, was slowly stripped for bricks by later builders who needed material for their own houses and walls. The impressive buildings that had anchored the faith of thousands turned back into piles of dirt and broken mud brick. The last priests probably held on longer than anyone else. You can imagine a small group of aging men trying to keep the forms alive in a city that no longer cares. They know the hymns, they know the rituals. They walk through empty courtyards that used to be crowded. At some point, even they run out of strength, students, or resources. After that, the wind and rain do the rest. By the time European excavators arrived in the 19th century to dig through Mesopotamian mounds, the people living nearby had their own stories about the ruins. Some saw them as haunted, others imagined kings or heroes buried there. Few, if any, knew the names Enlil or Anunnaki. The link between the physical space and the old sacred structures had been severed long enough that even local memory had moved on. When the first tablets were removed from the earth and carried to museums, the gods whose names they recorded had already been gone from living religion for more than 1,000 years. That gap is important. The Anunnaki did not vanish because of one single conquest or one dramatic revolution. Their presence in human life thinned out through repeated waves of change, imperial reshaping of the pantheon, new prophetic visions that rejected older systems, local rituals fading out with the deaths of their last practitioners. The result is a kind of double erasure. First, they were pushed into the underworld of their own religion. Then they were pushed out of living practice altogether. All that remained were marks in clay that no one could read anymore, and architectural skeletons slowly sinking back into the landscape. The question then becomes less about where the Anunnaki went, and more about what it actually means for a god to die, when that god only ever existed in the space between stories, rituals, and human experience. To understand what happened to the Anunnaki, it helps to step back from temples, ruins, and old myths, and ask a very simple question. What is a god from the point of view of the people who worship? Modern thinking tends to split the answer into two extremes. Either gods are real supernatural beings that exist independently of us, or they are pure inventions, stories people made up. Ancient Mesopotamians would not have recognized that split. For them, the gods were a presence that showed up when certain things came together. Sacred places, ritual actions, stories told at specific times, communities gathered in a particular mood. A god was not just a character living somewhere far away. A god was the way power, order, and meaning flowed through the world when humans connected to it properly. Think about the great temple of Enlil in Nippur. To a Sumerian, Enlil did not simply sit in the sky and occasionally look down. Enlil was most intensely present at that temple. The building, the rituals, the offerings, and the stories all worked together to create a zone where his power felt focused. The daily routines were not just symbolic. Priests washed and dressed the cult statue. They set out bread, beer, meat, incense. They chanted hymns at dawn, noon, and dusk. They followed a schedule mapped to stars and seasons. For them, these actions did not just show devotion. They kept the connection open. Without the cult, the god's presence in that place would weaken. Not because the god ceased to exist as an abstract idea, but because the pattern that allowed people to experience the god had been broken. In that sense, the god and the cult were woven together. When the rituals stop, what happens? The statue remains for a while. The building stands for a while. The stories survive in memory for some time, yet the felt presence fades. The god does not travel away in a spaceship. The god stops being active in that area of human experience. One way to picture it is as a radio signal. When priests are active, festivals held, and worship maintained, the signal is strong and clear. People tune in. They feel awe, fear, comfort, gratitude. They believe those feelings reach out to the god and that the god responds. When the cult collapses, the transmitter goes quiet. The signal does not move somewhere else in a physical sense. It simply is not being sent in that form anymore. The emotional energy that once gathered around that name disperses or finds other channels. That leads to something important. The human experience that sits at the root of religion does not vanish when one god disappears. The feeling of standing in front of something vast, mysterious, and powerful continues. Different cultures have used different words for that feeling. Awe, fear, holiness, presence. People across time report similar sensations when they enter what they believe is a sacred place or moment, a mix of attraction and dread, a sense of smallness and significance at the same time. You can imagine a Sumerian priest entering Enlil's temple at dawn and feeling that weight. Centuries later, a Judean pilgrim might feel something similar entering the temple in Jerusalem. A Christian monk might feel it in a candlelit church at night. A Muslim believer might feel it during prayer as the call echoes across a city. The outer forms change. The names change. The inner experience of encountering something greater than oneself does not disappear. It shifts focus. If the basic feeling stays, but the forms change, then the story of the Anunnaki is not just about one group of gods fading. It is about how the structure that once carried their meaning was reused. In early Mesopotamian thought, the Anunnaki formed the divine council. They were the assembly that decreed fates and held cosmic law together. They gave structure to the universe. When later religions insisted that there is only one true God, they did not get rid of the idea of a structured heaven. They rebuilt it. In Jewish texts, there are references to heavenly beings who attend the throne of God. They do not share his status, yet they form a court. The scene of the book of Job opens with these beings presenting themselves before God to report. In Christian traditions, detailed systems of angels develop. Seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, archangels, and other ranks appear in layers. Heaven is described almost like an imperial court with many roles and offices. In Islamic writings, angels carry out specific tasks. Some deliver messages, some guard, some record deeds, some manage aspects of nature by God's command. The idea that the universe is organized by layers of invisible authority remains. The names, stories, and theology are different from Mesopotamia, but the pattern is recognizable. Humans seem to need a picture of the cosmos that is ordered. A world of nothing but random events is hard to live in. A world where only one being exists with no supporting structure is hard to imagine. So religious imagination keeps building hierarchies, courts, and councils, even under strict monotheism. In that sense, the Anunnaki did not vanish. Their function migrated. What started as a council of 50 great gods becomes, in later systems, a variety of heavenly hierarchies. A person praying in late antiquity might no longer know the word Anunnaki, but they might still feel that decisions about the world flow through layered spiritual authorities. There is another twist. When new religions reject old gods, they often do so by pushing them into negative roles. Instead of being honored, they become examples of what not to worship. In early Christian thought, many older gods are recast as demons. They are still seen as powerful spiritual beings. They are no longer viewed as proper objects of devotion. Their images and myths are turned into proof of deception. The structure remains. There is still an unseen world full of ranked beings. Some serve the one God, others oppose that order. The game has changed, but it still looks like a game of councils and courts. So what does that tell us about the Anunnaki? It suggests that their story cannot be reduced to a simple question of whether they were real or not. They were real in the same way that law is real. Law has no body, you cannot touch it. Yet it guides decisions, shapes behavior, and gives structure to society through courts, judges, and texts. When the legal system changes, old laws lose their force. They can survive in old books. They can influence new laws in indirect ways. Yet they are no longer binding. The Anunnaki were like that. They were once the highest court of a particular civilization's universe. When that civilization changed its legal and religious structure, the old court lost authority. Pieces of it were folded into new systems. The rest survived only in archived texts. If no one prays to the Anunnaki, if no rituals are performed in their name, if no child is taught their stories as truth, then they stop being active in human life. That is what it means, in human terms, for a god like that to die. It is not an explosion in the sky. It is the quiet end of a relationship. And yet, even a dead language can be read again. A legal code that no longer rules can still be studied. In the same way, a god whose cult has ended can still exert an influence through memory when someone uncovers the traces. That is what began to happen when archaeologists pulled tablets from the ground and scholars slowly learned to read cuneiform. The Anunnaki, whose names had been silent for centuries, started to flicker back into awareness, not as living gods at the center of worship, but as figures in a vast story about how humans once organized the sacred. At that point, another transformation began. Not in ancient Nippur or Babylon, but in the modern imagination. When the first tablets were pulled from Mesopotamian soil and shipped to museums in Europe and beyond, no one knew that the names baked into them would restart a conversation that had been silent for thousands of years. Imagine those early days of excavation. Workers are digging through a dusty mound that locals call a tell. To them, it is just a hill with broken bricks and bits of pottery. To the archaeologists funding the dig, it might be the remains of a legendary city. They find walls, courtyards, gateways. Then they start hitting small flat objects. Some are broken, some are intact. They look like lumps of clay baked hard by time. The surface is covered in tiny wedges that do not look like any alphabet. At first, these tablets are treated like curious artifacts, decorations maybe. It takes time before scholars realize they are looking at the written records of an entire lost script. Decoding cuneiform was not fast. It took decades of comparison, mistakes, and arguments. Part of the breakthrough came from bilingual inscriptions, where the same message was written in two languages. Once scholars had a key, a huge amount of text lurched suddenly from silence into speech. For the first time in centuries, the voices of Sumerian and Akkadian scribes could be heard again. Not literally, of course. Yet their thoughts and routines, preserved in clay, could now be read out loud in modern libraries. At that point, the Anunnaki stepped back into human consciousness. They appeared in king lists, in myths, in hymns, in offering records, in legal formulas. Their name was scattered everywhere across the records of early Mesopotamian religion. But here is the important part. If you arrange those texts in order by age, something becomes visible that is easy to miss if you only pick out a few tablets here and there. In the oldest layers, from early Sumerian city-states, the Anunnaki are treated as a given. They are the great gods. They are invoked as the council that supports kingship and cosmic law. Their authority is unquestioned. Scribes do not bother to explain who they are. Everyone is expected to know. In those texts, oaths are sworn by the Anunnaki. Destinies are said to be written under their oversight. Offerings are assigned to them. They are woven into official life. Move forward in time to Akkadian and early Babylonian writings, and you see a subtle shift. They are still called great gods. They still appear in myths as powerful figures, yet their role has already begun to change. They share space with other divine names that are gaining prominence: Marduk, Ishtar, Shamash, Ashur. The Anunnaki start to feel like a group that supports those more focused figures rather than one that defines the entire system. Later still, in texts from the height of Babylonian and Assyrian power, their presence thins. They show up in commentaries, in copies of older hymns, in lists of divine names compiled by scholars who seem determined to preserve traditions that are no longer at the center of daily worship. Royal inscriptions from this era focus on the patron gods of empires rather than on the old council. By the late 1st millennium BC, explicit references to the Anunnaki are rare. The name appears in scholarly and ritual texts tied to older traditions, but has mostly disappeared from the language of living prayer. Taken together, the tablets show a clear pattern: big at the beginning, shrinking over time, eventually fading into technical vocabulary. What you do not find is just as important. There is no tablet that records a dramatic exit. No text says that the Anunnaki gathered for a final meeting and chose to leave the earth. There is no lament that describes a last appearance in a temple. There is no dated line saying that in a particular year they rose to the sky and did not come back. Instead, what you see is something more like a slow fade out. At first, the Anunnaki are central to the way people talk about power and the universe. Over centuries, they are written into stories where they have less initiative. They respond to higher gods. They follow decisions made by Marduk or Ashur. Then they are tied to the underworld in a more focused way. Then they are remembered mainly by specialists. The story the clay tells is not one of departure. It is one of redefinition and gradual loss of function. Think about how that compares to the theories that circulate online. Videos speculate that the Anunnaki were advanced visitors who left for another world. They quote old texts selectively, add modern images of spacecraft, and imagine a grand exit scene when the sky was filled with glowing vehicles. The tablets do not describe that moment. What they do describe is temples falling out of use, rituals changing, divine councils being rearranged, new supreme gods rising in stories that justify political power, older gods being moved into lower roles. The silence about a clear departure is not an accident. It reflects how religions actually change in real time. There is rarely a single day when people wake up and say, "We no longer believe in this God." Instead, practices shift. New rituals overlap with old ones. Children grow up learning slightly different stories. After a few hundred years, a once central God becomes a name in an old hymn that few people still understand. In that sense, the disappearance of the Anunnaki is not a special case. It is an example of how divine figures live and die within culture. They start as urgent answers to big questions. Who controls fate? Who backs the king? Who protects the city? Who keeps the seasons moving? As political structures and social needs change, people start answering those questions in new ways. New empires need gods that look like emperors. New ethical visions need gods that look more universal. New prophetic movements need a god who is beyond councils and hierarchies. The Anunnaki could not stretch far enough to cover all those new expectations, so their original job was taken over by new forms. The clay does not lie. When you read across centuries of tablets, you see the Anunnaki being pulled along by human transformation, not leading it from outside. They change when the world changes. They lose their central role when kingship changes shape. They sink into the underworld when top-level divine authority moves to a new throne. They slip out of common speech when monotheistic ideas make complex councils unnecessary. If you look at the pattern from far enough away, it starts to resemble the life cycle of an institution. First, it is born in response to a need. Then it solidifies and grows in prestige. Then it becomes rigid. Then other structures outcompete it. Finally, it ends up as a chapter in history books. The Anunnaki were an institution of the sacred. Their courtroom was imagined rather than built in stone, but its logic was embedded in every coronation, city foundation, and major decision in early Mesopotamia. Once that logic was outgrown, the institution became ceremonial, then obscure, then silent. What is left is an imprint in clay that we can now analyze. The more carefully modern scholars read those tablets, the clearer it becomes that the Anunnaki are not evidence of visitors from the stars. They are evidence of how deeply humans will weave ideas of order, judgment, and authority into the fabric of their universe when they are trying to survive and make sense of their place in a dangerous world. The question that remains is not where the Anunnaki went, but what their rise and fall tell us about the way humans design and redesign their gods as their collective mind changes. So what does the long arc of the Anunnaki actually show? When you line up all the evidence, it does not look like a story about gods stepping onto and off of a physical stage. It looks like a story about human beings reworking the shape of the sacred as their world changes. Archaeology shows temples that were not blown up in a single disaster, but slowly abandoned. Roofs collapsed, walls eroded, bricks were stolen and reused, sacred spaces faded into anonymous ruins. The tablets show names that do not drop off a cliff. They thin out. They move to different contexts. They slip from central prayers into side notes and scholarly lists. Religious history shows new systems rising that needed different kinds of divine structures. Empires wanted gods that looked like universal kings. Prophetic traditions wanted a god who could not share power with a council. Rituals tied to local fields and rivers struggled to survive when people began to think of faith in more universal terms. Psychology shows something else in the background. The sense of mystery and awe that once concentrated around the Anunnaki did not disappear from humanity. It flowed into new forms. It gathered around new names, new stories, new symbols. All of these paths point to the same basic pattern. The Anunnaki did not leave us. We left them, not in a conscious betrayal, not in a planned rejection, in a slow drift as cities changed, borders moved, trade routes stretched, and new ideas about right and wrong and divine justice took shape. They were never separate from the civilization that imagined them. They were, in a very real way, that civilization thinking about itself in sacred language. When city-states needed a cosmic version of shared decision-making, the Anunnaki were the supreme council. When empires needed a single throne at the top, that council turned into a cabinet. When underworld beliefs deepened, the council shifted into a court for the dead. When strict monotheism took hold, the whole idea of such a council lost official meaning and slipped into the background of theology. If you take that seriously, a strange and powerful conclusion appears. The story of the Anunnaki is not a side story about some forgotten gods in old mud brick cities. It is a case study in how humans build, use, and retire divine structures. They were a sacred operating system. Version 1 suited a world with many independent cities. Later versions suited empires. Eventually, A whole new software model arrived with very different assumptions, and the old system was archived. That should feel familiar. Think about technologies. People once relied on candles and oil lamps for light. When electricity spread, candles did not vanish. They migrated into new roles. They became symbols, decorations, pieces used in ritual or mood setting. The main function moved to a different technology. The Anunnaki went through something similar. When people needed a divine council to map their world, that was the main function. Later, that role moved into new frameworks. Divine councils turned into angelic hierarchies or symbolic scenes in scripture. The old name was no longer needed for the basic job to be done. At that point, something interesting starts to happen in the modern world. Once the tablets were deciphered, the Anunnaki did not only come back as a topic for historians and linguists, they began to leak into popular imagination. Writers noticed the dramatic tone of their ancient titles: great gods, decreers of destinies, judges in the underworld. Clips of translated myths inspired novelists, comic book creators, game designers, and eventually online storytellers. A new generation encountered the Anunnaki, not in temples or prayer, but through books, documentaries, and digital media. In that environment, a different kind of mythology grew. Instead of seeing them as pieces in a complex Bronze Age religious system, some voices recast them as advanced beings from another world. Old images of winged gods were reinterpreted as suits or gear. Descent from heaven was read as landing from space. Ancient buildings were recast as launch pads and starports. It is worth asking why that version caught fire in certain corners of the internet. Part of the reason is simple. It is exciting. Turning ancient gods into ancient astronauts allows people to connect myth with modern obsessions such as technology, space exploration, and hidden knowledge. Part of it goes deeper. Modern culture has a complicated relationship with religion. Many people have grown skeptical of traditional faith, yet still feel the pull of big questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Who or what, if anything, is guiding the story of the planet? Ancient alien theories offer a way to talk about those questions without using traditional religious language. The Anunnaki become a bridge. They are old enough to feel mysterious. They are distant enough that people can project almost anything onto them. So the pattern repeats. In early Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were shaped into a divine council that matched a city-based world. In Babylonian times, they were reshaped into supporters of an imperial god. In later myth, they were reshaped into underworld judges. In monotheistic imagination, they faded. In modern fringe theories, they have been reshaped once more into star-traveling engineers. Each version reveals more about the needs and interests of the people doing the reshaping than about any independent reality behind the name. That does not mean these stories are worthless. It means they are mirrors as much as they are windows. When Babylonians told the story of Marduk rising above the Anunnaki, they were explaining and justifying Babylonian power. When someone today claims the Anunnaki genetically engineered humanity, they are often expressing anxiety or wonder about science, evolution, and human uniqueness. The figure is the same. The emotional cargo attached to that figure shifts. Seen in this light, the Anunnaki are alive in a very specific sense, not as beings sitting on thrones in a hidden sky, but as symbols that keep getting reused. Every time someone writes a screenplay about them, every time a new theory video appears, every time their name trends in search results, attention flows toward that old word. A kind of new ritual takes shape, not in a temple courtyard, but in comment sections and forums. The sacrifices are time and clicks. The altar is a screen. The incense is a stream of speculation. That does not give the Anunnaki physical bodies, yet it does mean their name still does something in the world. It carries fascination. It raises questions. It invites people to revisit the ruins of the past and ask what those people believed. There is an irony in all of this. Many modern claims about the Anunnaki insist that mainstream scholars have hidden or ignored the truth about them. Yet the only reason the name Anunnaki is known at all today is because those same scholars spent their lives deciphering tablets and reconstructing myths. Without that work, the Anunnaki would still be buried in unread clay and worn stones. The popular stories that now use their name depend on an enormous base of quiet scholarship. The tablets the scribes pressed and stacked are now part of climate-controlled collections. The gods they once kept alive in human imagination have become exhibits in the story of religion. And that brings everything back to a simple, waking question. If the Anunnaki rise and fall as human needs shift, if they are reborn in new forms when people find new ways to use their name, what do they reveal about the age that is using them now? What does our fascination with them say about the things we are still trying to understand about ourselves, our origins, and the kind of power we imagine above or beyond us? Picture yourself standing in the dust of southern Iraq, not in a museum, not in a library, out in the open where the wind tastes like sand and old brick. You are at Nippur, or rather, at what remains of it. Once, this place was the religious center of Sumer. Kings came here to have their rule confirmed. Priests woke before sunrise to open temple doors. The great ziggurat of Enlil rose above the city like a man-made mountain. Now, it looks like a broken ridge of earth, heaps of eroded mud brick, trenches from old excavations, faint lines in the ground showing where walls once ran. The sun is moving down, shadows lengthen, the heat of the day finally begins to soften. You walk across what used to be the sacred courtyard. Thousands of years ago, this ground saw processions of priests and scribes and rulers, all moving with careful steps, all focused on rituals meant to carry their world safely through another day. The wind moves across your face. It moved here when the Anunnaki were invoked in hymns and when sheep were slaughtered at the altar. It moved here when the last priest performed a ritual that no one after him would repeat in full. It moves here now while you stand with a different set of questions. Where did the Anunnaki go? Did they ever really exist in the way modern stories suggest? What does their long fading mean for us? If you have followed the trail through tablets and temples and later religions, a different picture has probably started to form. The Anunnaki did not leave this world in the way a rocket leaves a launch pad. They did not retire to a distant star. They dissolved into other structures. They were never separate from the people who honored them. They were the shape of a certain kind of answer. Who rules the cosmos? Who gives kings the right to rule? Who guards the boundary between life and death? Who holds the ultimate court above any human law? For a long stretch of time, the answer in this region was Enlil in his temple at Nippur, backed by the Anunnaki in council. When the world changed, the answer changed. The need behind the answer did not. Standing among the ruins, you can see this more clearly than from a distance. The ziggurat is no longer a tower where heaven and earth meet. It is a mound where archaeologists once dug. The walls no longer direct processions. They guide your footsteps as you pick your way through broken foundations. Yet, the questions that once made this place feel like the center of existence are still alive in other forms. People still argue about what gives authority its legitimacy. They still wonder who or what holds the final word on justice. They still feel small when they look up at the night sky and try to imagine what is beyond the visible. The Anunnaki were one way of drawing a map. They were the markers that turned a frightening, unpredictable world into a story that could be lived in. At one time, that story fit the shape of life. City-states, regional gods, seasonal rituals, agriculture tied closely to river floods. As long as daily experience confirmed that pattern, the Anunnaki were useful and necessary. When circumstances shifted, the map had to be redrawn. Empires rose, trade stretched farther. Ideas about morality and human worth broadened. New images of the sacred offered solutions that could travel better across language groups and regions. Bit by bit, the Anunnaki lost their grip on the main role. They did not fail because they were weak. They fell out of use because their specific form could not stretch to cover the new mental and political landscape. Now their name lives in two very different spaces. One is the quiet space of scholarship, clay tablets in drawers, lexicons, articles, careful reconstructions of myths. The other is the noisy space of public imagination, ancient alien videos, graphic novels, forum threads filled with speculation. Both of these spaces circle around the same core, a human urge to connect ancient traces with present questions. If you listen closely to yourself while you stand in the ruins of Nippur, you might notice something. Your curiosity about the Anunnaki is not just curiosity about them, it is also curiosity about the way humans handle power and mystery. You are not just asking, what happened to these gods? You are also asking, how do we treat the things we once believed in when our world moves past them? Look at the broken bricks around your feet. They were once part of walls that people thought would stand as long as the world lasted. Their durability was a symbol, a fixed point in a shifting life. Now they are part of a landscape that most people would drive past without a second thought. That should feel familiar too. Every age builds structures, literal and mental, that feel solid. Every age writes stories that feel final. Every age is certain that its way of seeing the world is the conclusion of a long road. From a distance of a few thousand years, that certainty looks naive. The Sumerians walked through this city as if it would never stop mattering. The Babylonians told creation stories that placed Babylon at the center forever. The Assyrians carved winged figures into stone, confident their empire would endure. Now tourists visit those stones. The stories are read in quiet rooms. The cities are ruins. What does that say about us? We read about the Anunnaki and think we are looking at something safely distant, yet the pattern that shaped them is still active. We too organize our sense of meaning around structures that feel permanent. We too tie our identity to systems that will one day be studied as history. The Anunnaki show what happens when a civilization outgrows its own gods. It does not necessarily rebel. It does not always stage a dramatic rejection. More often, it drifts. It reinterprets. It reassigns roles. The old names become metaphors. Then they become references in texts that only specialists read. Then they become puzzles for strangers far in the future to decode. While you stand in this ruined courtyard, the realization unfolds slowly. The Anunnaki did not walk out of this place. We walked out of the mental world in which they made perfect sense. When the last person who could speak fluent Sumerian died, the direct line to that world broke. When the last ritual to Enlil fell quiet, a whole fabric of experience stopped renewing itself. What remained was stored in clay. Later, when those tablets were read again, the contents did not bring the gods back to life in temples. They brought them back as subjects of study, objects of curiosity, raw material for new myths. That double life continues. In one track, the Anunnaki are treated as part of the history of religion. Their story helps explain how humans move from many gods to one, from local cults to universal claims. In the other track, they are treated as possible keys to hidden truths, perhaps about human origins, perhaps about lost knowledge, perhaps about contact with something non-human in a more literal way. It is easy to feel frustrated by the distance between those tracks. Yet there is a shared root. Both the careful historian and the imaginative storyteller are drawn to the same thing. That quiet gap in the tablets where the Anunnaki do not say goodbye. One looks at the silence and sees a gradual cultural shift. The other looks at the silence and sees a secret waiting to be decoded. Either way, the silence is working. It keeps pulling eyes and minds back to these old cities and older questions. Standing here in Nippur as the light fades, you can feel the weight of that silence. The names that once filled this courtyard with sacred authority are gone from living speech. Yet a person from the 21st century has flown across the world, driven through hot flat land, walked over broken bricks, and is now thinking about those names again. In that simple fact, there is a kind of strange afterlife. The Anunnaki are no longer gods who receive offerings. They are patterns of meaning and memory that still help us think about how belief rises, hardens, and eventually dissolves. They are a reminder that what feels absolute in one time can become an object of gentle fascination in another. They point to a question that touches not just their fate, but ours. If gods can end without a clear ending, what else in our world carries the illusion of permanence while already moving quietly toward a different form? Walk away from the ruins in your mind for a moment and look around at your own world. Skyscrapers instead of ziggurats. Financial districts instead of temple quarters. Server farms instead of clay archives. It feels like everything is different. Yet the questions underneath are strangely familiar. Who really holds power? What forces decide our fates? Where does meaning come from in a system that feels larger than any one life? In ancient Mesopotamia, the answer was framed in the language of gods and councils. Today the words have changed, but the shapes those answers take are not so far apart. Think about the way people talk about markets. They rise and fall. They reward and punish. They are described as nervous, confident, angry, afraid. Entire governments adjust their policies to please this invisible force. People speak about what the market wants, almost the way a Sumerian might have spoken about what the gods have decreed. No one actually believes there is a single conscious being called the market sitting on a throne, yet it behaves in many minds like a kind of modern deity. It is a powerful pattern that no individual controls, that everyone must respect, and that seems to react to human behavior in ways that are difficult to predict. Or think about algorithms. On social media platforms and search engines, lines of code decide what most people see first when they open their screens. Those recommendations shape opinions, moods, and even elections. People talk about pleasing the algorithm, being punished by it, trying to decode what it currently favors. Again, no priest burns incense to an algorithm, yet creators make offerings of time and content. They adjust their behavior so that this invisible structure will reward them with reach and attention. It is not hard to see the echoes here. In one age, a scribe walks up the steps of a ziggurat, hoping that the right rituals will keep the favor of the Anunnaki and secure good fortune for the king. In another age, a creator uploads a video, watches the analytics, and hopes that whatever system sits behind the recommendation bar will smile on their work. Different tools, different symbols, similar anxieties. Who sees me? What gives me a place in this structure? How do I stay in good standing with a force I cannot quite see? That does not mean markets and algorithms are gods in a literal sense. It means that human beings continue to project sacred energy into complex systems that feel bigger than any one person. The Anunnaki were one way of giving those feelings a shape. Today, our shapes are icons on screens, brand names, charts that spike up and down. Something else fits into this pattern as well. Think about nations and ideologies. People fight, sacrifice, and even die for flags, constitutions, and ideas. They treat those symbols as more important than individual life. When you look at how those symbols are defended and honored, they behave very much like sacred objects. Ancient Mesopotamians tied the legitimacy of a king to the favor of the Anunnaki. If the Council of Gods withdrew support, a ruler lost the right to sit on the throne. Today, a government can lose legitimacy if it is seen as betraying the Constitution or the founding values of a nation. In each case, there is a higher framework that judges human authority. The name changes from Enlil and the Anunnaki to the people, or the law, or human rights. The emotional structure that says there is something above any one person that decides what is right is still there. Even in personal life, the pattern repeats. Someone might devote themselves to a career, a fandom, a cause, or even a lifestyle brand with an intensity that looks a lot like worship. Their days are structured around it. Their identity is bound to it. They look to it for guidance and a sense of belonging. Ancient priests would recognize the pattern even if they did not recognize the content. When you see this clearly, the question of the Anunnaki becomes less about distant history and more about a mirror they hold up to the present. They show that gods are not just exotic beings in old stories. They are what happens when humans gather meaning, fear, hope, and power into a shared picture and then treat that picture as more real than any single life. Once that picture begins to crack, the sacred energy does not vanish. It moves. In Mesopotamia, it flowed from councils of many gods into the throne of one. In later centuries, it flowed into scriptures, ideals, and ethical systems that claim to speak for the same ultimate reality in a different tone. In the modern world, a lot of that energy has flowed into science, technology, and narratives about progress. Many people now trust laboratories and satellites to tell them what is true about the universe. They look to medicine to save lives, to engineering to protect cities, to data to guide decisions. These are not religious in the old sense, yet they often carry a similar emotional weight. A person who would never kneel in front of a statue might still feel an almost sacred awe looking at images of distant galaxies or at the complexity of DNA. The language has changed. The feeling of encountering something vast and beyond full comprehension has not. So where do the Anunnaki fit into that picture now? In one way, they are finished. The temples are gone. No one in Nippur today wakes at dawn to offer bread to their council. Their myths are preserved on tablets and in translations, not in living ritual. In another way, they have slipped into a new role. They have become symbols through which we explore questions about belief, memory, and transformation. When someone watches a video about the Anunnaki and finds themselves fascinated, part of what draws them in is the sense of a lost world that once took different answers for granted. It is a strange feeling to realize that a civilization could exist for thousands of years, build cities, write libraries, run complex economies, all while organizing their reality around gods whose names most of the planet had forgotten until about a century ago. That realization can be unsettling. If they could take their gods as real and permanent, and we now see them as part of a closed chapter, what does that say about our own frameworks? What will people thousands of years from now think of the systems that feel unquestionable to us? Will they look at our borders, our currencies, our arguments about growth and decline, the way we look at Sumerian debates about which god controls the wind? Will they see our most serious conflicts as expressions of a particular mental world that eventually gave way to something else? The Anunnaki are a reminder that no system is safe from becoming a story. Once, their decisions felt like the final word. Now, their rise and fall is a case study in how belief changes over time. That recognition can be depressing if you crave a permanent answer. it can also be freeing. If sacred systems are not immovable objects dropped from the sky, but living structures that humans build and refine, then we are not just passive observers, we are participants. We are always, consciously or not, shaping the next version of the map that future people will take for granted. We are choosing what kind of power we treat as ultimate. We are choosing which stories about reality carry the tone of truth in our minds. We are choosing which structures we will invest with authority over our lives. In that sense, the question is not only what happened to the Anunnaki, it is also what are we building that will someday play the same role in someone else's memory that they now play in ours. Think for a moment about how languages work. Latin, for example, is often called a dead language. No one grows up speaking it at home. There are no street markets where prices are shouted in Latin, no love songs on the radio written in it. Yet Latin is everywhere. It lives inside Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Romanian. It shapes the vocabulary of science, law, and medicine. It hides inside mottos carved over university gates and on national seals. You can say that Latin died as a living tongue. At the same time, its structure never really left. It dissolved into other forms that people now use every day without noticing. The Anunnaki are like that. Not as a language of sounds, but as a language of sacred order. Once, their name was spoken in daily rituals. Their presence was assumed when kings took the throne. They were the underlying grammar of how cosmic authority was described. That specific form is gone. No one today walks into a temple and prays to the 50 great gods of the assembly in Sumerian. Yet the way they organized the divine world did not simply evaporate. It flowed forward into new systems. When later writers imagined the heavenly court of a single god, surrounded by ranks of angels, they were using a familiar blueprint. When theologians described layers of spiritual beings with different responsibilities, they leaned on a habit of thinking that had been shaped long before in places like Nippur and Uruk. The names changed. The labels on the chart shifted. The underlying pattern, the idea that the universe has a structured backstage full of ranked powers, remained. This is what makes the Anunnaki so interesting. They give us a visible example of how a spiritual structure can be born, flourish, then be absorbed into new frameworks. They show that religious evolution is not just a long fight between true and false ideas. It is also a process of recycling. Old gods become new roles. Old councils become new hierarchies. Old sacred feelings attach themselves to new symbols. Think again about the temple rituals. In Mesopotamia, priests spent their days tending to statues. They washed them, clothed them, brought food and drink, sang songs at appointed times. These actions were understood as necessary work to keep the connection between the city and the divine realm open and healthy. From a modern point of view, that can look like superstition. Why dress a piece of carved stone, knowing it will not literally eat or drink? From the inside, it felt as essential as maintaining the electrical system feels to us. If you do not care for the contact point, the flow of power is disrupted. Later, religious systems did not keep the statues. Yet they kept the idea that regular practices, done carefully and in the right spirit, maintain a relationship with the sacred. Daily prayers, fixed hours of worship, repetition of certain words, special clothing for religious officials. The tools changed. The logic remained. The Anunnaki are part of that story. They sat at the center of a world where sacred order was imagined as a council. That world passed its habits forward. Even when later religions insisted on a single god, the impulse to organize heavenly reality into recognizable structures remained. The forms we see now are descendants of a pattern that the Anunnaki once expressed. None of this means the Anunnaki must be treated as secretly active beings hiding behind new names. It means something subtler and, in a way, more impressive. They were part of a cultural technology that proved so effective at making sense of the world that it survived in altered form long after the original gods fell silent. A legal code that no longer applies can still influence later laws through its principles. A philosophy that no one openly follows can still shape how people argue and think. In the same way, a pantheon that no one worships can still shape the way later generations imagine the space between humanity and ultimate reality. Think about that the next time you read or hear about angels and demons, or about spiritual forces in high places, or about invisible powers and principalities. The language is different from Sumerian tablets. The emotional structure is familiar. There is still a sense that unseen layers of agency exist above and around ordinary life. That is the ghost of the Anunnaki, not as literal beings, but as a way of mapping the unseen. The clay tablets that preserve their name are more than archaeological curiosities. They are evidence of earlier stages in a long experiment. Humanity has always been trying to answer the same core questions. What is the universe really like behind appearances? Who or what is in charge? How do we fit into that larger picture? Every age sets up its own model. Sumerians built divine councils of 50 gods. Babylonians built cosmic monarchies with one god at the top. Prophetic religions built visions of a single universal god with layered helpers. Modern cultures build models using forces, laws, and systems. None of these are simply lies. None of them are complete either. They are attempts. They are sketches of an overwhelming mystery. The Anunnaki were one such sketch, drawn in the language of mud brick cities and river agriculture. When that world was replaced by others, the sketch did not vanish. It was folded, copied, smudged, and redrawn in new styles. Now their story is returning to the conversation in yet another form. Not through priests standing on ziggurats, but through people like you, scrolling through videos and articles, wondering what these old names mean. It is easy to treat that curiosity as pure entertainment. Another topic in a feed full of strange facts and dramatic theories. But there is something deeper happening whenever we go back to these ancient stories. We are not only looking at them, we are measuring ourselves against them. How did they deal with fear and fate and death? How did they legitimize power? How did they imagine justice beyond human courts? And, whether we say it out loud or not, we are asking a quieter question. Are we really so different? We have more information, more technology, more science, yet we still create invisible structures that govern how we think life works. We still project personality into systems that respond to us in complex ways. We still search for patterns that make our experiences feel less random. The Anunnaki are no longer cosmic rulers. They are a case study. They show that gods are not frozen beings outside history. They are living frameworks that rise, change, and fall as human consciousness evolves. They show that when a god disappears, the need that God once answered does not vanish with it. It moves on, looking for new forms. And they invite a question that only becomes possible when you realize that. If the gods of one age are the frameworks that age uses to hold its deepest questions, then what kind of gods are we quietly building now, even if we do not call them gods at all? Look around at the world you live in now, not just the physical world of buildings and roads, but the invisible one, the world made of networks, feeds, trends, and narratives, the space where most of your attention goes when you open a screen. You do not see temples on every corner, you see logos. You do not see carved stone councils of gods, you see metrics, rankings, and charts. And yet, if you look closely, you can feel something familiar moving underneath. Every time a new technology arrives, people do not just use it, they build stories around it. Think about how people talk about artificial intelligence. In some conversations, it is framed almost like a coming deity, an all-seeing, all-processing mind that will soon know everything, solve everything, or threaten everything. People speak with awe and fear. They imagine a future where this new power gives out rewards and punishments according to its own logic. In other conversations, AI is a tool, a product, something that reflects, amplifies, or distorts human desires rather than ruling over them. Either way, the language around it is full of images that you could slide directly into an ancient myth with only a few changes. A mind that sees patterns humans miss. A power that can reshape work and fate. A force that might become unaligned with the people who created it. You can almost imagine a Sumerian hearing about machine learning and describing it as a new class of spirit, a being created by humans but capable of acting beyond any one human will. What we call technology, earlier ages might have called magic. Now think about money. Money itself is just paper, metal, or numbers on a screen. Yet it organizes almost everything. Where people live, what they eat, which cities grow, which industries rise or fall. Whole lives are built around pursuing it. Whole systems are designed to protect it. It rewards certain behaviors. It punishes others. It shifts suddenly and can make millions vanish from a balance sheet in seconds. People speak of it as if it has a mood. Markets are nervous today. Investors are greedy. Capital is fleeing. Once again, you can feel the shape of something that used to be described with divine language. In Mesopotamia, a bad harvest might be blamed on a god's anger. Today, a financial crash might be blamed on the market turning against certain assets. In both cases, people are trying to make sense of complex systems that no single individual controls. None of this means we should start calling markets or technologies gods. What it does show is that the human habit of treating certain patterns as sacred is still very much alive. We find something bigger than us. We see that it can grant and take away. We build rituals around it. For traders, a ritual might be checking charts every morning and following specific routines on trading days. For creators, it might be posting content on a strict schedule and adjusting to each new wave of algorithm changes. For fans, it might be returning every week to a favored franchise, treating new releases like sacred events. These rituals rarely use religious language. They are framed as strategic or cultural. Still, they structure life in a way that echoes older temple rhythms. Ancient priests once studied the sky for omens. Modern analysts study data for signals. Both are trying to read meaning in what looks like noise. So what does this have to do with the Anunnaki? Their story shows what happens when a framework that once felt absolute becomes optional. It shows that divine structures are not fixed objects in the sky. They are processes that bind human minds together around shared answers. Once you see that, it becomes easier to notice that you are already inside new versions of those processes. Think about fandoms. Some people organize large portions of their lives around music artists, sports teams, or fictional universes. They attend gatherings. They wear symbols. They learn long backstories. They use those identities to find community across borders. In another age, such emotional energy might have gone into cults of particular gods. A citizen of Uruk could have centered their life on Inanna. A person in another city might have been devoted to Enki. Today, one person is devoted to a band, another to a team, another to a game world or a series of films. It is not the same thing. Yet, it is not entirely different either. There is devotion. There is shared language. There is a sense that this thing makes life feel more meaningful. Now imagine how all of this will look to someone thousands of years from now. Picture an archaeologist in some far future, digging through what remains of a city that once held millions of people. They find our equivalent of clay tablets, bits of code stored in decayed drives and fossilized servers, fragments of videos, screenshots, snaps of comment threads. They do not speak our languages fluently at first. They have to decode them like we decoded cuneiform. They might put together a picture of what we took seriously. They would see long debates about stock prices and interest rates. They would see passionate conflicts about fictional characters. They would see massive attention poured into platforms called by names that no longer exist as companies but still sit in the data. They might conclude that these forces, these companies and systems functioned like gods for us, not because we thought they lived on mountains, but because we treated them as the highest reference points in our decisions. You can almost imagine one of those future scholars standing in the ruins of a collapsed data center asking something like, "What happened to the algorithm? Why did they stop serving it? When did it lose its place in their world?" They will have the same problem we have with the Anunnaki. From the inside, changes feel gradual. No one notices the last year that a certain social network really mattered. No one knows exactly when a trend was truly alive for the last time. People just drift to new things, new stories, new obsessions. From the outside, it looks like a sharp break. 1 century, the traces of a god cover tablets and temple walls. A few centuries later, that god is gone from daily life and only appears in technical copies of old texts. 1 decade, a platform or belief system looks unshakable. A few decades later, it is a footnote in a historical overview. The Anunnaki are a vivid example of this illusion. To the people who believed in them, it never felt like they were watching a god die. They were simply responding to shifting empires, new prophets, and different ways of understanding the world. To us, it looks like a clear arc: rise, transformation, descent, erasure. The same pattern will apply to many things we assume are permanent. Certain brands that feel eternal now will someday only exist in museum exhibits and nostalgic comments. Certain laws that feel unchangeable now will be seen as products of this specific moment. Certain philosophies that feel cutting edge now will be read as quaint. The Anunnaki stand in the background of that reality like a quiet reminder. No structure is safe from reinterpretation. No answer is safe from being replaced. No god, however central in one age, is guaranteed to be more than a chapter in another. Instead of making that realization cynical, it can make it more urgent to ask a practical question. If our frameworks are not forever, then what are we building into them while they are here? Are they deepening empathy or hardening divisions? Are they making life more meaningful or more mechanical? Are they helping us live with mystery or pretending to solve it in ways that shut down curiosity? Those questions are not about ancient tablets. They are about the choices we are making right now while we design the systems that future generations will treat as obvious. Some of them might even whisper to themselves the way we do now. How could those people have lived like that? How could they have believed those things? And somewhere, under those questions, the pattern that once shaped the Anunnaki will still be at work. Now shift the scene again. Not the ruins, not the future archaeologist. A quiet room behind a museum instead. No tourists, no glass cases, just long shelves, dim lights, and row after row of storage trays. On those trays lie thousands of clay tablets. Most people who visit the public galleries never see this part. This is the backstage, the place where history waits in low light, wrapped in foam and labelled with codes. Pick up a single tablet in your imagination. It fits in your hand. It is the color of dried riverbank mud. The surface is dense, with wedge shapes pressed by a reed stylus before you were born by tens of centuries. It looks silent, yet if someone has done the work to read it, they can tell you exactly what that scribe wanted to record. Maybe it lists grain rations for workers. Maybe it sets out offerings to be made to a list of gods. Maybe it is a hymn of praise, or a fragment of a myth, or a legal decision. Now picture not just one tablet, but a sequence of them, not random pieces, a timeline. Early tablets from Sumerian city-states, later tablets from Akkadian rulers, texts from the age of Babylon, scholarly copies from even later periods. You move your finger across the columns of transliteration on a modern page, following one word as it appears and changes. Anunnaki. At first it shows up constantly. This king rules by the decree of the Anunnaki. This offering is set aside for the Anunnaki. This myth calls on the Anunnaki when destinies are written. The council is right there in the foreground, as obvious and necessary as mentioning the state or the law in a modern official document. Then as you turn the pages of time, the context shifts. The word appears in hymns that have more lines about Marduk or other high gods. It shows up in lists of divine names that place new deities in rankings above older ones. The council is still present, but it is not always at the top of the hierarchy. Turn more pages. You begin to see the Anunnaki in scenes set below the surface of the earth, judges in the land of the dead, witnesses in the shadows. Not the whole council of heaven anymore, but a specific set of powers connected with endings. Turn more pages. The word appears most often in scholarly exercises. A student scribe copies an old hymn that mentions the Anunnaki because that is what his master wrote on the board. He might not even fully understand the theology behind the term. For him it is part of a language to be mastered. In another tablet, a priest collects and comments on divine names, trying to preserve old knowledge in a time when new systems dominate daily worship. In a third, the word is already damaged, a broken sign on a broken tablet, a syllable that has to be reconstructed by a modern scholar comparing similar passages. What you do not find in this time-lapse is a tablet that says, in simple lines, that the Anunnaki packed up and left. The record does not show a celestial exodus. It shows a reorganization. That lack of a farewell inscription matters. If the Anunnaki had been understood primarily as visitors from a specific star, or as physical beings walking the earth and then departing, the scribes might have tried to mark that moment. They recorded eclipses, floods, dynastic changes, building projects, treaties, omens. They were not shy about adding commentary when they thought reality had shifted. Instead, what the tablets show is that the Anunnaki simply stopped being required at the center of how people talk about the universe. Their job is reduced. Their status is lowered. Their name is used in narrower and narrower ways. At the same time, the structures that once depended on them are rebuilt in new language. Fate is still decreed. It is just framed as flowing from a single god rather than a council. Justice is still imagined as rooted in something higher than human preference. It is just described with different titles. The afterlife is still pictured as a place where decisions are made. It simply does not always need the old council to preside. Seen through this lens, the tablets are not evidence of missing chapters about lost visitors. They are very clear evidence of something else. They show how internal the gods were to the societies that worshipped them. The Anunnaki rise with a pattern of politics and culture that needs a divine assembly. When empires build a different political logic, that assembly is rewritten. When monotheistic worldviews sweep in, the concept of a council is thinned down and repurposed. When rituals stop and temples close, the names that supported those structures slip into dormancy. The clay captures the stages of that process without needing to comment on them. A scribe writing in the time of Hammurabi is not thinking, I am recording the slow decline of the Anunnaki. He is thinking, I am praising Marduk correctly, using all the proper divine titles, so that this hymn will work. A priest copying a very old Sumerian text in a late period is not thinking, I am preserving fossils of a dying pantheon. He is thinking, this is what the tradition says. I will not be the one to break the chain. From their point of view, they are simply doing their jobs. From our point of view, they are leaving a record of transformation. Put archaeology next to that. Ruins show temples that do not all fall in a single dramatic fire. Many crumble piece by piece. Some are deliberately dismantled. Others sink into soil as canals move and populations shift. Combine that with the later history of religion in the region. You see new faiths arrive that treat the old gods as at best outdated, at worst actively misleading. Their sacred texts encourage distance from those older systems. Add one more layer, the psychological one. In every stage, people still feel awe. They still need a story about order and justice. They still experience moments when they feel they are standing before something beyond comprehension. That whole stack of evidence points toward one coherent explanation for the silence around the Anunnaki's departure. They did not leave in a way that looks like a scene from a science fiction film. They transformed along with the people who once believed in them, then faded once their specific shape no longer matched the world people lived in. If you accept that, a different realization appears. The Anunnaki are not mainly interesting as potential hidden rulers in some secret history. They are interesting as a clear and detailed example of how religious and symbolic systems evolve. They let you watch, step by step, how a divine institution can start as the center of everything, get adjusted to fit new politics, be pushed into less visible roles, and finally survive only in written memory. They let you see how a god can go from unquestioned reality to forgotten name without a single moment where anyone writes, "Today, this god ceased to be." And in that slow fade, they reflect something uncomfortable back at the present. If a divine council that once ruled the imagination of cities for 2,000 years can become a topic on a streaming platform, then none of the forms that feel absolute in your own time are as permanent as they seem. The patterns behind them might endure. The specific names and structures probably will not. The tablets in that quiet museum room are not only telling you about Sumerian myths, they are delivering a message about how human beings treat their deepest answers. We build them. We live inside them. We adjust them when they stop fitting. We forget where they came from. Someone centuries later digs up the record and tries to understand what we once thought was unquestionable. That is what happened to the Anunnaki. They were not simply erased by time. They were carried along by a process that is still moving, which leads to the last and most personal turn in this story. If the Anunnaki's disappearance is really a story about our own transformation, then the question hidden inside their silence is not just about them at all. It is about what we are quietly turning into stories right now, without realizing how temporary they might look from far away. So here you are, not in Nippur, not in Babylon, in your own room, your own city, your own century. Maybe you have headphones on. Maybe you are listening in the dark while you try to fall asleep. Maybe this video is playing in the background while you tidy your room or sit on a bus. However you are here, you are now part of the long chain of people who have whispered the name Anunnaki and tried to understand what it really means. And that is where everything quietly turns. Because after walking through tablets and temples and empires and abandoned rituals, the most important question is no longer about them. It is about you. What do you treat as unquestionable in your world? What sits at the center of your decisions without you even realizing it? What do you sacrifice time, energy, and attention to day after day? The Sumerians would have answered those questions with the names of gods and cities. Enlil, Inanna, Nanna. The sacred center of their universe was mapped with temple courtyards, river cycles, and the council of the Anunnaki. When they worried about drought, invasion, or injustice, they pictured those fears moving across a landscape of divine powers. Their solutions were rituals, offerings, and hymns that kept the cosmic order aligned. You have different symbols now, different maps, yet the need underneath is the same. You still live in a world that feels unstable and unpredictable. News cycles flash by, economies tremble, technologies transform whole industries in the span of a few years. You still feel small compared to the systems that shape your life. It is tempting to believe that you have moved past myth, that gods and councils are old mistakes other people made. But if you look at how your own culture speaks about its highest forces, you will start to see the outlines of new pantheons. We give certain words a kind of sacred glow. Freedom, security, growth, innovation, the market, the algorithm, the nation, the future. We build institutions around these words. We write laws and design apps and structure education to serve them. We tell stories in movies and shows and songs that present them as the unquestioned background of life. You may not bow before a statue, yet you might check a screen 50 times a day to see how your work is performing according to a metric someone else designed. You might feel joy or anxiety based on numbers that move up or down without a face. That is not so far from a farmer in ancient Sumer watching the water level of the river and wondering if the gods are pleased. We have traded clay tablets for dashboards. We have traded priests for engineers and analysts. We have traded hymns for trending sounds. The structure is still there. There is a center where decisions seem to be made. There are processes we do not fully understand. There are rituals we perform in hope of a good outcome. The story of the Anunnaki is a reminder that whatever we put in that central space will not last forever. That should not make you hopeless. It should make you thoughtful. If every age constructs its own sacred architecture, the question is not whether yours will be permanent. It will not. The question is what kind of effects it will have while it lasts. Will the things you treat as ultimate make you more compassionate or more isolated? Will they push you toward curiosity or toward defensiveness? Will they give you a sense of connection to other people or only a sense of competition? The Sumerians built a sacred system that tied their gods to the cycles of rivers and crops. That system helped them survive and organize their world. It also limited what they could imagine. When empires rose, when ethical ideas expanded beyond single cities, their divine council had to change. You are living through similar shifts. You are watching technology redraw what it means to know, to work, to belong. You are watching climate, politics, and culture move in ways that feel both frightening and full of possibility. Whatever stories you choose to believe about those shifts will one day look as dated as the Anunnaki look to you now. That does not make them meaningless. It makes them powerful in a different way. They are temporary tools that shape how you act in the face of uncertainty. So here is the quiet invitation hidden inside the ruins of Nippur and the storage rooms of museums. You cannot control the vast systems that define your age. You cannot fully predict how they will change, but you can decide how you relate to them. You can decide whether you treat money, status, technology, or ideology as if they are cosmic judges, like a modern Anunnaki council, or whether you see them as tools that need to be kept in their place. You can decide whether you let invisible systems tell you what you are worth, or whether you hold on to values that are not measured by views, likes, or profit. You can decide which stories you will let live in your mind as if they are sacred, even if you never use that word, because that is where gods really live, not only in temples or scriptures, but in the combinations of feeling and thought that people agree to treat as ultimate. The Anunnaki lived in the space between fear of flood and hope for order. They were the form that ancient Mesopotamia gave to its longing for justice and stability. Today, the names are different, yet the longing is the same, for a sense that life is not random, for a belief that actions matter, for a story that connects the tiny span of a human life with something larger. When you think about the Anunnaki now, you can see their whole arc laid out. Born out of a city-based world, raised to the height of cosmic authority, reshaped by empires, sent down into the underworld, replaced by monotheistic visions, forgotten in practice, rediscovered in clay, recast in modern imaginations as everything from demons to aliens. That arc is not only about them, it is about the way human beings constantly rework their answers. Standing in imagination at the ruins of Nippur, you feel the wind move over broken brick. Then you picture yourself closing the video on your device. The room you are in returns. The past goes quiet. But something has changed. You now know that behind every divine name, old or new, there is a human world choosing how to see itself. Behind every sacred council, there is a pattern of power. Behind every disappearance of a god, there is a shift in what people need from the universe. So the next time you hear the word Anunnaki, you will hear more than a mysterious label. You will hear a whole civilization thinking out loud in sacred language. And maybe, in the same moment, you will hear a softer question inside yourself. What names am I giving to the mystery right now? What do I treat as beyond question? What do I quietly sacrifice for? What would a future reader of my life conclude about the gods I served? If you feel like sharing that answer, you can drop it in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from, what time it is, and what you think our age's new gods look like. Then, if you want more journeys like this, you can tap like and subscribe so you do not lose that thread. Because in the end, the story of the Anunnaki is not really about lost gods in distant cities. It is about the way every human era builds a sky above its own head. And somewhere, far in the future, someone may read our traces the way we read their tablets and realize that we too were doing what people have always done, reaching up into the unknown, giving it names, living inside those names for a while, then leaving them behind for the next version of the story.